You're listening to the Dirt School Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Johnson, and if you like hunting, fishing, country stories, and learning lessons from those who live their lives in rural America, you're going to love this podcast. Brought to you by Hunt Real Outdoors. Well, speaking of whitetails, and I had a few questions here that I was wanting to ask you, and one of them was, I want to just kind of go back in your mind maybe a little bit to your favorite whitetail kill, your favorite whitetail hunt. Tell me about that, and then like maybe what it was that helped you, what you did that helped you kill that deer. So to just
Yeah.
kind of get us into some strategy there.
Yep. So yeah, that's one. There was a deer in Kansas called the Trax buck, and the reason he was called the Trax buck is it was in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. Really low deer density, but there was a railroad track that went on the edge of this property. It was kind of the property boundary, and you would literally see more trains than you would see deer. But there was a giant in there. And the history of this deer, when he was a 4-year-old, a guy shot him through the top of the shoulder backstrap area as a 4-year-old as about a 180. And the deer went over the tracks into this huge cedar thicket. And he got permission to go look for the deer in that cedar thicket. It was a few guys that hunted that, but they allowed him to go in there. They were more rifle hunters, and this was bow season. So he went in there, and when he came back, he never found the deer, obviously, because he hit it too high. But he said that was the most blown up whitetail bedding area thicket that he had ever been in. He said there were rubs in there. Just, it was insane the amount of buck sign that was in there. So the next year, as a 5-year-old, the buck showed up again, and I'll probably have my years. I know he was shot as a 4-year-old. 5-year-old, the buck showed up again. Nobody hunted him that year. The following year, I had a really good friend from Ohio that went in there and hunted the buck for the entire rut. Never saw him. He was getting up into that 190s type area. Never saw him. Hunted him the entire season, and lots of nighttime trail camera pictures. Everything was focused on the railroad tracks. That because of the thicket on the other side, that had to be where he was leaving. So all the trail cameras, everything was focused on that area. And the following year, as a 7-year-old, I went in and hunted him, and I did the same thing. I hunted basically from the end of October, not all the way to Thanksgiving, but pretty close. I mean, there were lots of days. There were all day sits for this deer, and I would see 2 coyotes, and that was it the whole day. I mean, it was rough because there were no deer in that area. Very, very few. And again, would get every now and again, we'll get a nighttime picture, and then after the season was over, I talked to my buddy that I hunt with out there, and he's like, yeah, I don't know that the buck's killable on this property, because it was all nighttime pictures. So I got drawn the following year, and I was not going to hunt the buck. I mean, he hadn't shown up. There were no pictures of him, nothing. And so Chris said, hey, I've got another friend that's coming in from Iowa or somewhere to hunt, and he's not too serious about it. I think I'm going to send him out there just to kind of mess around. And I had found another buck to hunt, and I actually went in and killed that other buck pretty quickly. And so I was tagged out in Kansas, and this guy went right beside, like unmotivated at all, went right beside the farmhouse, basically, dumped out a bag of corn and put a trail camera on it. And within 2 days, that buck showed up in daylight on the corn pile.
Oh, wow.
And he's got double flyers off his back. He was in the 190s as an 8-year-old, and just mass everywhere. And I'm like, daylight picture, corn pile, that is unbelievable. And then I looked at the map, and I'm like, I am such an idiot. At the absolute other end of there's a creek that ran through the property, and it was a very long, narrow property. The property was only about probably 200 acres, but the creek ran through it. It ran under that railroad track. And if you followed the creek all the way back, there was a county road. And right on the other side of that road was a small, call it 15-acre grown up cattle pasture that an old couple owned and nobody hunted. And where that guy had set that corn pile up was right beside the old farmhouse, and there was like an old cattle barn, dilapidated cattle barn right there, and he had actually just driven into that cattle barn that was not used anymore and poured the corn out right there. And I'm like, I'm such a dummy. That buck is living in that old cattle pasture where nobody messes with him. And every time somebody comes in here, he's seeing exactly what's going on. And so the guy hunted for like 2 days and left. But I had that intel. And I said, okay, if that deer makes it through the season, I got a plan. And so I'll land the plane here. So the following year, I went in there and ended up getting drawn 3 years in a row, which was very lucky to be drawn 3 years in a row in Kansas.
Right.
But went in, set up on that creek. There was a really tight pinch there, so I set up a north wind stand, a south wind stand, and this was in the probably around the 10th, 12th of October when I got all this set up. And my plan was to come back in November. I was putting cameras out to see if he was alive, and going to come back 1st of November and hunt right in there the whole rut. And flew home from Kansas, and I had the cellular cams. And when I landed, I had a daylight picture of him walking back through that funnel, going back to that cattle pasture.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. So there was a cold front coming on like the 19th of October. I told my wife, hey, you good with me going back out there? And she said, yeah. I have a very, we've been together since we were 18. So have a very cool, understanding wife. And so she always very supportive of my craziness. So flew back out there, north wind. I had great access. I had it all mapped out ahead of time. And sure enough, the first afternoon, the temperature started to plummet. There's on that creek, there was an old cut soybean field, and there was a doe out in that field that I could see. She was probably 80, 90 yards away from me. And I heard the cattle wire fence ping. And I said, man, that sounded like a deer, hitting that wire. And all of a sudden that doe threw her head up, and I thought, uh-oh. And sure enough, I was looking back the way he should be coming from, and it was just antlers appeared. Man. And he came right up through that funnel and stopped looking at that doe, and I shot him at like 22 yards. And that was the end of the tracks buck. But the point being, the lesson I guess learned there is you can't get pigeonholed on your thinking. Everybody was focused, including myself and everybody else, on that big thicket over the tracks. But that buck had found that out of the way spot to bed. And, he had lived his whole life and had survived. I'm sure as a fawn, his mom was living in there or whatever. And, he learned that lesson of, this is how I survive. And then figuring that out just by happenstance of a guy, dropping a camera in a weird spot, and boom, there he was. And so I kick myself, and I try and keep as open a mind. You'll look at a map or a topo or whatever it may be and go, this is the spot. But you just can't get tunnel vision on that. You got to, look at big picture and try other things. So that was the lesson learned in that hunt.
Yeah, I think a lot of times as hunters, that's something that we do, is that we get stuck thinking one particular thing. And those deer, man, especially those big bucks, I mean, they're going to do their very best to stay away from that pressure. And I was interviewing Caleb Griner earlier this year, and he killed a 177-inch buck. He called it Vendetta, and he killed it off the ground. He snuck up on this deer, and it was tending a doe, and he killed it. But he jumped this deer, and he started realizing that some of these little pieces of property there in Iowa, he's in Iowa, it's just maybe just it might not be a 2 acre little grass patch or something out in the middle of a wide open field. And he started learning that all these big bucks was laying in that stuff away from people. And you're getting nighttime camera pictures here and there, but they're in those little places, staying away from the pressure of people. And I think sometimes we really forget that. We look at a little spot like that out of the way and go, they probably not over there. But a lot of times that's where they are, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
They're masters of their environment for
oh
sure.
yeah, 100%.